Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy Thomas. I'm at the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education, which is located at Tisch College at Tufts University. And I'm very excited to have a co-conspirator here with me, and that is Dwayne Wright. These projects, I love meeting new people. I love, sharing ideas and then learning that they care about this stuff too. And so I feel like I do have a co-conspirator in Dwayne. Dwayne, I wondered if I could turn it to you for 1 minute and you could introduce yourself to the group.
Sure. Well, thank you, Nancy. And the feelings are more than mutual. Nancy Thomas has been working on these issues well before they were sexy in the media. And we'll continue working on them until we find together a right way to do it. So publicly, thank you, Dr. Thomas, for all your work on this. It really is appreciated. Folks, my name is Dwayne Wright. It's Dwayne Quasi Wright Barrington III, for those of you that want the full title. And that represents a pretty long name for a pretty long lineage. I was born in a Caribbean country called Trinidad and Tobago. I grew up in Venezuela and Brazil before immigrating to America and settling down in New York City. I have the privilege of serving as an assistant professor of higher education administration, as well as a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at the Graduate School for Education and Human Development at the George Washington University. And I have the distinct honor and pleasure of responding to the absolutely wonderful framework that Nancy is going to present to you today, and then to lead us all in a conversation about that framework. So I am so excited, and I'll turn it back over to Nancy to get us started.
All right, thanks so much. All right, I'm going to turn on my slides and hopefully get them into the right way. In other words, get them to look like a slideshow. Here we go. All right, Dwayne, can you see that?
Yes, I can. You're number one.
All right, that's great. So one thing that would be great is if you all wouldn't mind going onto the chat and putting in your names and where you're from. And I love the idea of hearing one adjective or very short phrase about what you think the state of American democracy is right now. We've just come off of an election, but that's not democracy. Democracy is more than just elections. And so if you go into the chat, put your name, where you're from, and then maybe just say, I'm feeling good about it, or I'm feeling worried about it, or what are your feelings about the state of American democracy right now? That would be great. The other thing is we are going to try to monitor the chat. And so as things come up, if you have questions, put them in the chat and then we'll come back to them. Right this minute, I kind of want to blow through some slides. I call it reading fast and taking chances. And so that's what we're going to do, is we're going to blow through some slides and read fast and take chances. So I do see a lot of familiar names and pictures, images, and even some faces in there. And so for those of you who know me, you know that I'm at this amazingly interesting research institute at Tufts University. And we have 5 buckets of research and then one really big bucket that we're going to talk about today. Obviously, we do student voting. Those of you who know us for the NSOLVE study probably have very dog-eared reports on your students' engagement in democracy, but we also study campus climates. We look at political equity, or better phrased, political inequity. We look at the state of political discourse and discussion teaching. And then over the last, I don't know how many years, I've been focusing on the state of American democracy and how the heck we're going to make it more inclusive, equitable, and just. So one of the things that we've been doing is we've been trying to frame up what we see as the threats to democracy. And what we're going to try and do is get colleges and universities to start educating to address the threats. What I think we've been doing in the civic movement in higher education, at least, is involving students in experiences. And yet it's not real clear to me that those experiences are actually creating the kind of individuals we need who are going to fight for a better democracy. And so one place to start is with a clear understanding of what are the problems in democracy. And we've been working for about 1.5 years to frame these up. I'm not going to go through them at great length. We will be publishing this, but one of them I think will be very familiar to you. It's about democratic backsliding and disenfranchisement. For example, we have many decades of efforts that have been somewhat successful around civil rights, and yet those efforts are backsliding. And so it's called backsliding democratic principles and practices. One of the things I don't want to see happen this year, if we are able to get colleges and universities to mobilize around this agenda, is I don't want them to think that the goal is to revert to some kind of status quo. It's not. It's time that we work on the underlying foundational systems of oppression, discrimination, and that have made the current conditions possible. Obviously, we've got problems with distrust. Climate change is an existential threat to humanity globally, but what it's also doing is it's causing a lot of displacement that is then causing a lot of people on their borders to say, we don't want you here. And that kind of treatment of immigrants when we were formed as a nation that would take people of all sorts of backgrounds, that is, in my view, at least, un-American. And then, of course, we've got this neutrality challenge and the erosion of academic freedom. As I say, we can come back to that, but that's not really the point of this presentation. So about, well, I'd say about, let's see, 2010, there was a group of civic organizations that I would call democracy reformers. They're on the front line of making democracy work the way they should. They're everything from, for example, Everyday Democracy that works on discussion-based change in communities that absolutely examines disparities in power and privilege as they work to change communities. Or Demos, or the ACLU, or the Brennan Center, lots of different organizations working to make democracy work the way it should. And they were convening because they were hoping that with the Obama administration, they would have an opportunity to make significant strides in changing democracy. And I heard that they were meeting, and I said, can I come? I represent maybe a little bit of higher education. And they said, no, you can't. And the reason for that is they felt that higher education was actually part of the problem, not the solution. And then what academics do is they decide what needs to be taught without really thinking about what is happening on the ground and what is needed.
Sure.
So I went to these meetings and I sat in the back of the room and I came up with what I call the conceptual framework of a democracy by design, a better democracy. And it had 4 pillars that you can see at the top. Don't memorize these because the whole point of this talk is to tell you these are now outdated. But these were what we published in an article in 2014 called Democracy by Design. In 2018, we published it again, this time looking at the emerging threats to democracy. The idea of it was that all students would learn the overarching framework that a democracy that we want is participatory, free, equal, informed, educated, and so forth. And that all students would have one deep dive experience. And it could be in their field, it could be in the arts, it could be in the performing arts, it could be in political science, it could be anywhere, but they would do a deep dive and they would study one aspect of each of these 4 pillars of democracy. What we then did is about 18 months ago, the Lumina Foundation contacted me and said, we read this thing that you put out and we wondered whether you wanted to revisit it. And that was a breath of fresh air. Not too many foundations actually dig into things that people have written, particularly a while back. And what they really wanted to know is, would the old framework work to address the current threats to democracy? In other words, would the old framework be adequate for addressing democratic backsliding, the erosion of academic freedom, some of the things that I put in those slides before? And the obvious answer was no. The other really important thing to me was that it needed to be re-examined through the lens of people who were going to be the future leaders of this country, people who are younger, more diverse, more scrappy, and they could really put a fresh lens on democracy by design. And so what we did is we convened a lot of the old organizations that were doing democracy reform work, along with some of the new organizations doing democracy reform work. We interviewed them. We looked at everything that's being published these days on the state of American democracy, and we kicked the tires on the old framework. And this is the new framework. All right. Now, first of all, I want to just give a shout out to who is we. And we is my team at IDHE, and that would include Adam Gismondi and Margaret Brower. But we also brought in a very scrappy, sharp team from Loyola University Chicago, and that is Dimitri Morgan, Norma Lopez, and they had a phenomenal student working with them, Tori Calais. And so that's the group that did this, but we also consulted a lot of people. One of the other things that we did is we made sure to define democracy, because I think democracy is such an amorphous term, and people think it's relegated to political science only, or that group, but we need to be addressing democracy across the curriculum. We need to be looking at democracy as a publicly relevant thing to all disciplines. And so one way to do that is to define it. And we started with a definition of democracy, not just as a form of governance, but also as a culture, a society, a set of conditions and traits and attributes and normative values that make our societies work better, because we have a governing system theoretically that is of, by, and for the people. And so if your democratic culture is breaking down, your democratic governing systems will break down too. But then the flip is also true. If your democratic governing systems are not nurturing the diverse cultures in this country, then you're going to have a breakdown that comes from the other direction. So all of these then become that top framework, those pillars for a democracy reimagined, a democracy that is inclusive, equitable, and just. And I'm not going to go through every single slide alone, but I am going to just tell you that what we've got is, these will come out. I'll share these with you all. And so one of the things about the democracy that we want is that it is contested and reinvented. So what does that mean? Everybody in education has probably read the quote by John Dewey from the early 1900s that says, democracy is born anew with every generation, and education is its midwife. Well, if education is populated by an elite group, an affluent group, a privileged group, a select group, if until literally the growth of community colleges and state colleges and universities, women's colleges and MSIs and HBCUs, it was a very white male group. So if that's the group reinventing democracy in every generation, you're going to not reinvent it with the new generation in mind. And so what we want to do is literally provide opportunities to contest democracy, to really challenge it, and then to reinvent it. And we think that these mechanisms for doing so, for example, have to be inclusive. They have to welcome dissent. They have to explore alternatives. These are skills that you should be teaching your students so that they can be active reinventors, if you will, of the democracy we want. Another one that I really like, and this was one that we had a lot of discussions about, was how do you make democracy compassionate? How do you make sure that people have the power, the freedom, the agency to pursue their personal aspirations, but then in communities, people are compassionate about each other. They're interested in each other. They know that I really miss, for example, not sure it ever was, but I even miss the ideal of decency. That we should be decent. Our politicians should be telling the truth. They should be honest, and they should be empowering others, not just themselves. So a compassionate and empowering democracy is another one. We also wanted to be accessible and participatory. The outcome of an accessible and participatory democracy would be one that is representative, where people can see their identities and their interests represented not only in governing structures, but their communities. It is educated and informed. There's a lot of debate about which level of education has a role to play here. They all do. And I think it's really important, but also we need to be teaching an accurate and complete history about race and discrimination in this nation. No, we cannot be censoring that out of our curriculum, and we have the academic freedom to make sure that we aren't censoring it out of the curriculum. Responsive and just, this is a requirement that people, communities, and governments be nimble and they are reflective. I think somebody's got their mute button off. So I just wondered if somebody who's unmuted could mute. Thanks. And then finally, this idea that new generations and new populations are viewed as alternatives. I mean, as really good alternatives for new ideas, for new perspectives, for innovation, and for improvement. That is a difficult thing for some of the older generations to even fathom, but that is that's what's going to make our democracy work, is if we engage younger generations and more diverse people in this process. And then finally, the outcome of a democracy that is all these other things is one that is trustworthy. We cannot demand that communities or governing systems be trusted. They have to earn it. So with that, I am going to I'm going to pull back up the framework, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dwayne to, give us some thoughts on this, and then we'll open up to the rest of you.
No, thank you, Nancy. And once again, thank you for the work that you and your group and those that worked with you have done. For those that may have come in a little late, my name is Dwayne Wright. I'm a professor of higher education administration at the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at the George Washington University, which is in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. And I play a dual role there as Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives. And I would like to thank Nancy and the organizers of this conference for allowing me the opportunity to react, not just as someone who is responsible, in my opinion at least, for training the next generation, the soldiers, the participants, the priests of democracy, which is our students right now, but someone that's also responsible for making sure it's done in a responsive, a just, a equitable, choose your right adjective sort of way. When the organizers decided to allow me to do this, the task was a tall one. They said, Dr. Wright, we'd like to stand in for higher education and respond to the framework. There are so many ways that I can stand in for higher education as someone with a doctoral degree. And there's so many other ways that me representing higher education is going in the wrong direction, not just from what we want to do, but from this framework wants to do. I have to acknowledge my privilege. I have a PhD, I am a lawyer. So I see things in a very legal way. Despite the fact that I happen to be African-American, I'm also a man. And I am privileged, and I benefit from the privilege that a society dominated in patriarchy will be. I am, someone that is an immigrant to this country, but I don't know, for example, the indigenous process and those that were, First Nation here. And what does democracy mean when you are sitting on stolen land, right? So rather than stand in for all of higher education, what I'm going to do is going to give you a few thoughts. I'm going to go into each of the sort of pillars here, and I'm going to offer a suggestion of what I think can make it well, and why I think it's so important to keep the framework and strengthen it as well. While I'm doing that, feel free, because as soon as I am done, we're going to engage in a conversation with you all here today. So feel free to use the chat. The first thing I would say in reaction is, what is the use of a framework, right? Many of you just came out of Sylvia Hurtado's session earlier. And, one of her guiding principles is the framework for dialogues across difference. And when I first saw this, Nancy, what I thought was, this is wonderful. And the analogy that I'm going to use is one of traveling. Maybe you're here, and I am in DC. Maybe you're in New York City, where I grew up, or whether you're in a small town in Iowa or wherever you are in America. You understand, when you learn to drive, I don't know, some of you were back in the day before GPS. I'm young enough to have learned with GPS, right? And if you want to get to someplace, you need to get to the address. And I think this is a wonderful address. When I'm trying to get to work, I put in 2134 G Street here in Washington, D.C. But, there are times when you get tripped up. There are times when the road is closed. There are times when in DC, a diplomat or one of the president's family decides to go someplace and you get cut off. So any good framework needs to not only acknowledge that it is a guiding light as a GPS, but also leave enough vagueness, enough flexibility for the people on the ground to detour. And I think that when you test this framework, the operationalization of it will be tested on the ability to detour. For example, when we talk about accessible and participatory, many of your students might see that as democracy being accessible to them, as how can I get to the ballot? Right? Do I have early voting? So if I come home or I fly home on a weekend for Thanksgiving, I can vote in the Georgia runoff. I don't have to stay all the way to Tuesday. And then some other students might say, well, Dr. Wright, when I think of accessible, I think of it in a different way because I'm a disabled student. And my polling place, I can't even get into. So even if I register to vote, how am I going to get into there? And we need to have enough flexibility in each of these pillars to be able to answer for both students. And that's what inclusive democracy is all about. Number two, I understand, and anyone who's here from higher education needs to understand, and I'm sure you do, that there are many problems that we place on higher education to solve, that higher education plays a small part in actually causing the problem. It was, interesting when Nancy came to that particular organization and they said, no, higher education is the problem. Well, I think education, the lack of education, the lack of access to education is the problem. And if we're going to use this framework as a pillar and the pillars they're in for higher education, we need to acknowledge that what we truly need is a P through 16 strategy. And for those of you that don't know what that is, that's pre-K universally through 16. If after 12th grade, you go to 13th grade, we know most students will take 6 years to graduate, but let's not P through 16. You understand what I'm saying? And we need to apply this not only to higher ed, but to principals within K through 12 as well. Can we start early to let students know about compassion over hyper-individualism? Can we start early to let students know about the value of being educated and informed and not just right? And we must follow that. Well, another thing that Nancy said was, we're the best and our brightest. It's so interesting that if you're a high school counselor talking to a student trying to go to college right now, the thing that you're going to encourage them to do is to take AP this and AP that, almost not as a way to further their participation in democracy, but as a cop-out. If you take AP government, you don't have to take it in college, with your fellow Americans. But we need to understand that most people, when they come to college, the benefit of college is not just what they learn, but who they learn it with. Can we use a framework P through 16 that enforces an ethos in education that says this is not about racing to a destination, but about enjoying the journey that our ancestors contested to give us to actually make a more participatory democracy. Now to the pillars themselves. I will start with what I think is the most important, and that's the contested and reinvented. And Dr. Thomas started there, and I think that was quaint and appropriate because this is probably the most important to our young people today. To understand democracy, not as a stagnant thing, but as something that not only requires change, but is a vehicle for change in and of itself. The one tool to make sure that we are a more perfect union, all the tools that were given to us, not necessarily etched in stone, as an originalist would say, but the principles of dialogue and debate that were handed down to us. And we need to understand, and I think we can teach our young people, not just in a civics education, but throughout our higher ed curriculum, that the tools you're learning, whether it be in a chemistry class or a political science class or an art class, are tools that will allow you to contest the world around you and reinvent it if consensus comes the way you would wish. The one question I think I would have here is the question I'm going to ask, quite frankly, throughout all. If we ask and talk about democracy, it's always about democracy for whom and what does democracy require? So contested by whom and reinvented by whom? What does contestation make and what does reinvention require? Does it require sometimes swallowing your own pride and understanding that only a compromise solution will get advanced? And sometimes that might not be the most equitable solution right now, but as Dr. Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I won't hit all of them because I do want to hear what you want to say. We want to leave a lot of time, but I want to go on to compassionate and empowering. And I think that this is incredibly important because we have lost a lot of compassion, not just for our fellow Americans, but for our fellow man. And what we do not teach enough in higher education is the need for understanding someone as human before you understand them as stereotypical. Then when I look at Nancy, I understand that she is white. I understand that comes with privileges. I understand the concept, the beautiful concept that Kimberly Crenshaw gave us of intersectionality, that knows that the privileges of her whiteness are also mitigated by the patriarchal nature of being a woman in America. And I have compassion for that. But compassion also comes with empowering, and empowering is the agency. How can we give our young people the agency to recognize their oppression, but overcome it? To not be swallowed by the ways that in which they have been oppressed or have been unjustly treated, but in ways to overcome it. And I'm wondering within this framework, what do we really mean by compassionate and empowering? Compassionate for whom? Empowering for what? Moving on to educated and informed. I think this is a very important one, that we need to understand the danger. Many of you put that you were concerned about this democracy in your chat and your reaction that Nancy asked, the danger of misinformation, the danger of disinformation, but also the danger of a little bit of information. Right now in higher education, we have so many tools where students can get online, get on YouTube, watch a lecture, and get half of the story. And that half of the story is asking America, asking family units, is the cost of college really worth it? And the way I sell students is when you pay to get to college, you're not paying for your biology school, or you're not paying for the Khan School of Physical Science, you're paying for the whole shebang. Can we reimagine, as John Lombardi says, colleges as quality units, and that students are actually paying for the entire university, so that we're not just forcing humanities students to cross over to the hard sciences, but hard sciences to cross over as well. And that is so important, educated and informed, that we have a participatory democracy of Americans from all walks of life, not just for the rich, not just for the blue collar, not just for the white collar, but for everyone that comes in here and calls themselves American and calls this place home. My question here, once again, is informed about what? Now that we have a generation, 60% get their news more from Trevor Noah, who just left, and TikTok than they will get from CNN, MSNBC, or even Fox News. Is it higher education's responsibility under this framework to place our products, place our content where the students are, rather than waiting for them to come to us? Should we be a little bit more humble? To responsive and just. I think this is probably the most contested issue, because what is just to one student will be oppression to another. One of my specializations at the George Washington University is an investigation of hate speech and uses of not just things like the N-word by faculty in class, but uses of proper pronouns in class. What do we think as a field of higher education is justice? And can we accept that that is not a neutral term, that we have to take sides? And it's not about taking a left or a right side. It's a taking side against what is unjust. And can we do what we often are not allowed to do in higher education, is simplify to explain and say that we're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to educate you on how to think so you can come to your own definition of what is just. And if we can do that, then we are being responsive, not just to the needs of our students, but to the moment. And finally here, because I talked a little bit about accessibility and participatory, trustworthy. And this, my dear friend Nancy, might be the most important one. We are losing the trust in democracy, because I think what we're teaching our students, again, P through 16, but particularly on the higher education level, is that it's not trustworthy unless you agree with it. How do you know if an election was trustworthy? If you won. And I think that is a #1 way to lose our democracy. So as I end here and I go it over to questions, I want to challenge everyone here today from all of the many organizations that I hear, some within higher education, some without, some NGOs, some nonprofits, some with big bank accounts, some with small and just community sort of outreach. How, as a field, can we add to the trustworthiness of everything that we do, the trustworthiness of knowledge, the ontological and epistemological spaces we create, and separate outcome from necessarily the process? What this framework, I think, is going to enlighten us to do, and my colleagues to do, whether you work in admission, whether you work in finance, whether you work in civic education, is the process of creating minds, the process of creating citizens, the process of creating folks who are prepared, who are sensitized to live in a just society, and to know that trustworthiness does not mean that you will always win. It does not mean that when you lose, you should have lost. It means that sometimes you'll win, sometimes you lose. But once again, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the universe is long, but it will bend towards justice. And if we can train students more to trust that, I think maybe, just maybe, we'll go a little far to save our democracy. I think this is a lovely framework. I think it's a beautiful address to get us to where we go in the GPS. But my friends, we still need to drive. We haven't got to the point where cars drive us ourselves. Maybe Elon will get us there in 10 years, but I can promise you, even if we get there as cars, the analogy won't stick. Democracy doesn't work without the active driver in there. And not only are you here the active driver, but you have the awesome responsibility of training the active drivers as well. Why don't you join us in that challenge? And I look forward to your questions.
Okay, you just have to all give me a minute. That was an example of what I hope will happen on college campuses when they're presented with this framework. A real opportunity for discussion, for critique. Whew. So thank you so much, Dwayne. That was thoughtful, provocative, and exactly, as I say, what I hope will happen. So people can put comments in the chat. They can put questions in the chat. They can raise issues. Dwayne and I would love to hear from you. And you can also talk amongst yourselves if you want, exchange some ideas, but put them in the chat.
Feel free to use the chat. Feel free to unmute, say who you are, where you want to go. Say, Dr. Wright, I agree with this. Dr. Wright, you were completely off base with that. Push back. We
Yeah.
have a couple of minutes here, and the only way we make this better, not just democracy, but the framework is, if we all pick up the tools and we're a carpenter for it. So talk to us, put it in the chat. What are you thinking?
Yeah. And how might you use this?
Hi all. It doesn't let me show my video, but thank you so much. That was really awesome. I'm Bethany. I'm the director of Wesleyan Engage, which is Civic Engagement Service Learning at Virginia Wesleyan University. But previously, I by accidentally put in the chat to everyone, I did just graduate with my master's from Merrimack College in Massachusetts. And I went to Virginia Tech undergrad, so I have been familiar with being in Virginia. But it is interesting coming, from Massachusetts, going to a more southern state, especially Virginia, with it being, as people like to say, purple, right? And so that's been really interesting. But I want to touch on how you said, that we're all first a human being, and kind of highlighting that and seeing that first. And I think that that's really awesome, and something that I've tried to push, not necessarily as the director or really in my role as at VW, but just in general, talking with people, right? It's so divisive sometimes, even within families and within friends, just talking about the fact that we're all human beings, even though all you might see is, that someone's female or someone's Black or whatever it is. It's really cool that you highlighted that.
No, thank you for that, Bethany. And I think that, a lot of times people think inclusive democracy is carving out a space in a democracy for one group, and it's not. Democracy requires dialogue. Democracy requires dialogue sometimes across difference and sometimes across really deep-seated differences amongst ourselves. And that's not something that humans are born with. That's something that is taught. And, if we're going to continue to ask students to pay the exorbitant amount of funds they pay to get into college, and then not inform them with the tools to service our democracy when they leave college, we're going to lose it, right? So I think that was incredibly important. I don't know if Nancy has a few words on that while I scour the chat, because I see a few good questions coming in.
No, I just think it's a really good point. And I'd actually like to jump to something in the chat. Thank you, Bethany, for those comments and that observation about place-based experiences, and how do you transfer this from a place like Massachusetts to a place like Virginia, but also to a place like some many other states. Every state is so different. So I think that one of the questions was, how might this get used? And I think that's a great question. I'd actually love to hear from others on how they might use it. And Dwayne, when you first looked at this, did you have thoughts on how you might use this?
Yeah, so I'm going to mix this with another question. I think Gene Corbin asks, we've had great frameworks in higher education. How do you make this, operational in institutions and beyond? And the reason that I went there is, Gene, when I first saw this, that was my first reaction. Like, oh my God, another theory, right? Here goes another theory that we're going to test someone on. And then when it comes down, it's not going to be used, right? My experience in higher education is we have lovely theories. And what I teach my students at GW is everything I'm going to teach you, and I say this on the first day of class, is a after the bottom line theory, right? It's all about the bottom line, right? And I think the way we operationalize this, we have to actually elevate these particular pillars to principles by which we make decision-making for students throughout higher ed. So it can't just be in the classroom. It needs to start in the classroom, right? Because everything we do around education starts within that learning environment, which is intentionally created. But if you're going to set up a learning community in a dorm, for example, are you doing it in a compassionate and empowering way? Are you doing it where the issues are contested and reinvented? Are you doing it when it's educated and informed? Who we allow to be on our college campuses under the constitutional law that we have? Is the college campus and the access to our students as not just voters, but consumers of information accessible and participatory? If we have someone who is contested on an issue, let's say on a contested issue like Israel and Palestine, how are we making sure that we do, as under the rabbinical tradition in the Jewish faith, preserve the dissenting opinions and make sure that they feel heard, and and that they always know that the process is equal, even though the outcome might not necessarily be always just. So, how do you operationalize it? It's got to be a part of a foundational message. Every time we think about what we do, we got to be thinking back to this. That's going to be hard. It's going to be a lot of change that's needed. How could I use this? Just one clear example is we have at least 6 diversity programs every year at GW, just in the education school. It's probably hundreds more around the school. And I would love to next year use this framework as a pillar for each of our programs. One that informs about compassion and empowering. One that shows that democracy can be contested and informed. One purely to educate and inform. One that focuses on responsive and just society. One that focuses on accessibility and participatory. And one that, of course, most importantly, builds trustworthiness within our community and without our community, within ourselves. Too often in higher ed, we're Ivy sort of, not apart from the community rather than a part of the community. And to really inform democracy, that needs to end. Because still, we live in a country where only 35% of Americans will even enter college. So what are we doing in college that impacts those that are out? So that would be my best answer to that question.
I think that's a great answer to the question. This is not the first rodeo for me, right? I mean, I published this in 2014 and again in 2018, and it didn't stick. So this question of what do we do to make frameworks stick is really important. This time it feels pretty different. And one reason why it feels different is because there is a deep sense, and I think it's widespread, that democracy is not working. It has never worked. It doesn't work for everybody, and it's about time we fix it. I also see that this youngest generation, they are increasingly diverse. They are very activist and they're ready to move. They want to recreate democracy. I think we should let them. I also love the idea of this being that point on the horizon for, steering the ship, or the address, as Dwayne put it, where we drive the car. But I don't know that I see this as a mandate. I see it more as a discussion guide or an opportunity to kick these ideas around on campuses. That said, we have a real problem with academic freedom. And we have to remember that academic freedom gives us the right to teach what we want to teach, as long as it is linked to an educational purpose and an educational mission. And as long as we are not articulating democracy as one of our educational missions, we are not going to have as easy a time fighting for academic freedom. And yet academic freedom really is a social contract between higher education and American democracy. We have academic freedom so that we can educate for democracy. We educate for this kind of democracy so that we are using our academic freedom the way it should be used. So I think there's something for everybody in this. And I love the idea of putting it in first year experiences and working, certainly framing up decision making. This is not just a framework for learning, it's a framework for institutional priorities. And so I think that would be a great way to use it. I don't know how much time we have left, but at the very end, I'll tell you what we are going to do with it. But I want to open it up and make sure others have a chance. If you've got ideas about how to use it, or you've got other questions.
Yeah, and I just want to say also that the test of a very good framework is its adaptability, right? So I think that this could be used on a lot of different colleges. So how this would be used at Howard University and HBCU would be different than how it would be used at even FAMU, which is an HBCU in Florida, right? How this would be used at the Catholic University of America here in Washington, D.C., because the definition there of compassionate and empowering would be very different than BYU, which is a church run by the Church of Latter-day Saints, better known as the Mormon Church, right? I think that what we've designed here, really what Nancy's designed here, I can't use the word we, even though I like it,
You can
use the word we.
I'm recruiting you. You're never out of the business. You're never out of the loop now.
Is something that is wide enough that we really think it could be acceptable by anyone that really wants to transform democracy, right? And those are the pillars of the vision that we need to have, not the pillars of the vision that we have right now. There are those that support democracy and those that don't. And those that do need to come together and start speaking as loud, writing as loud, working as hard as those that don't.
Other thoughts out there?
Yeah, I'd just like to agree with you on that, that there's like so much work to do, when you think about the stuff that's gone down in the last 6 years in the USA, it's like, it can be pretty, depressing to the point of, I think this is what happens is people just like get, frozen. And I think it's so important to keep moving.
That's a very good point, Tom. Paralysis by analysis. There's so much that needs to be fixed that we end up fixing nothing. One of the great things that Nancy is offering to you here is a couple of pillars. Pick one. You might not be at a point right now on your campus where students want to be compassionate and empowering. So pick educated and informed. You might not be at a point right now because they are not trustworthy that we can get to responsive and just. Work on trustworthiness. You understand? Just pick one. And, if you can't run, you can walk. If you can't walk, you can crawl. But just keep going.
Yeah.
One thing I would, first of all, who are you?
I'm Tom Vogt, University of Augsburg, and I imported an engaged scholarship seminar here at the University of Augsburg, and a part of the UC Links network, University Community Links with Berkeley.
Yep, very nice. So I just want to put a little emphasis on one thing, and that is that I personally do not think the problems have anything to do with Donald Trump. I think he was a symptom or an opportunist, but we have decades and centuries of systems of oppression that we have to fix in order to get to this democracy. That's been the problem, is we've been putting band-aids on all of these problems for so long that it's time to rip off the band-aid. It is time to have these conversations. And we've rolled this out to people. They say, oh my gosh, Nancy, it's so liberal, it's so progressive. What? No, this is not liberal and progressive. This is democratic. It's time to fight for it.
No. I mean, it's really common sense.
It is. And frankly, I don't know any conservative that you stick this under and say, you know what, democracy should be accessible and participatory, and they say, no, it shouldn't.
Yeah.
Of course they do. It's a question of getting there, getting on the same page, having conversations, and empowering younger generations that are going to take this agenda and run with it.
Well, I mean, one thing about this, the arc of time, bending in the right way is that, I mean, in 20 years, the whites are going to be just another minority. So it's like, just hold on, play the time game for 20 years. And you cannot win an election by like insulting over half of the people. So, what?
No, you can't. And, even though in 20 years that white people will no longer be a numerical majority, that doesn't mean we're not going to have conservatism. Some of the most conservative people I know, and I am African-American, are African-American. And that could go from my Uncle Joe to Brother Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah.
So I think that, we have sold the inevitable change in America as good for one group and bad for another. And the data just doesn't play that out. And I know, now you're saying, well, Dr. Wright, you're a doctor, the data is not, but the data just doesn't play that out. Doesn't play that out. I love Becca's extension of my analogy in the chat, thinking about diagnostics and tune-ups and smog checks, because all that is going to be needed, right? If you're thinking, okay, I've got this framework and, I'm going to just install it and it's going to work smoothly. That's not how it's going to work. That's not how democracy works. You understand? We had a democracy, that first, no one voted directly for senators. And then we changed that. And, at the start of the Constitution, I would be considered 3/5 of a person. And now just, a decade ago, someone that looked like me was president of the United States. That is the American tradition. the ability, as Nancy so puts in one of the pillars, to contest and reinvent, examine, tune up, smart test, contest, and reinvent. And I think if you take nothing away from this sort of presentation, you take nothing away from this framework, it's that we need to empower the next generation for themselves, give them the agency to contest and reinvent.
I think that's great. I know that we are probably pretty darn close to out of time, and I don't want to hold you off over. I will say that our next steps are we will be publishing this. We are going to be publishing it with some papers on the threats to democracy, the role of higher education in getting us to an inclusive, equitable, and just democracy. It will be rolled out as a series. But we are also seeking money for several things. And I think Illumina will be helping us out here, but other foundations as well. One is that we need boots on the ground. You know, we're going to need people on campuses who can speak eloquently to this work and push for it. And so we're trying to figure out a way to start a large group of people who are going to be pushing this work. We also think that this needs some curricular support. And so we are looking for money so that we can do some curricular planning and developing tools for educating against the threats to democracy. And those will be multidisciplinary small groups. We're calling them collaboratories, and they will put out teaching tools, because what we're seeing is that the low resourced institutions are not able to put this stuff on the agenda because they don't have the bodies to do it. They don't have enough people. So we want to empower the campuses that don't have a lot of money. The campuses that are big research ones, they've got people who teach this stuff, but what about everybody else? And so we've got to find a way to make this accessible to a lot of people. So we're going to be rolling it out. We're going to have some fellows on the ground, and we're going to be doing some curricular work so that we can empower institutions to use this. But then we're also going to let it grow. And, you know, I joked earlier when I said Dwayne he's stuck with me now. You know, that's what I'm hoping will happen. We talk this up, and then people come forward and say, you know what, I want to run with this on my campus.
Plus the social media.
Really great. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, with social media, we can create like functional systems.
Yeah,
That's an impressive point, and that's where the students are. You understand? We did a study that said 65% of students learn more from TikTok than anything they will listen to in a freshman lecture in the first year of college.
Yeah.
You know, so if that's where they are and we're choosing to abandon those spaces, we're choosing to abandon our democracy to whoever is on TikTok. And typically that is the neoliberal people that just want to sell these students products, and they're not interested in actually empowering them with the tools to run for democracy. So we cannot abandon the minds of the next generation to that. You understand? That would be, you know, a disservice to America. And everyone here, the only reason that you're here is because you probably have benefited from the American experiment. Don't let it die with you.